Episode 3. There are, for both Plato and Freud, connections between sexual and tyrannical behavior. Both share the telos of an unrealistic striving for immortality in terms of compromise formations. In the one case, the formation centers around bodily likeness, and in the other, these formations center around the remembrance involved in the reports of the exercise of power on the pages of history books. Thanatos, son of Nyx, the goddess of night and brother to Hypnos, was, for Freud, hidden in the dark and mute, only emerging into Freudian theory when it became clear that there was something else above and beyond the pleasure principle operating in the mind of his most difficult patients. Freud's use of hypnosis as an initial attempt to confront the powers and agencies operating in his patients' minds must have originated in his love of the classics. Here we have a Heraclitean clash of opposites requiring a logos. Freud suspected the presence of the so-called death instinct very early on in his theorizing. As his thoughts matured, he searched for this logos in the thoughts of Plato, Aristotle, and Kant. We ought to remember, Freud had been working in the field of biology in his early days. The use of hypnosis proved not to be sufficiently erotic, connected as it was to a reduction in the field of consciousness, almost the exact opposite of the expansion of the field of consciousness Freud was searching for. As early as The Interpretation of Dreams, Freud clearly saw the connection of language to becoming conscious, as did his patients, one of which referred to psychoanalysis as the talking cure. Freud also very quickly saw the limitations of relying on a language-based association under hypnosis, where the analyst was the tyrant ordering the patient to get better whilst he was at his mercy in a diminished state of consciousness. He retained a language of desire which was designed to strengthen the patient's ego with resources such as dream interpretation, free association, and techniques connecting to rejecting the desires involved in the transference neurosis, a state in which the patient seeks a master to hate. This hate is attributed to Thanatos, and Freud expands the sphere of influence of Thanatos into the regions of violence and destruction, probably as a consequence of the discovery of the self-destructive behavior of some of his patients. Thanatos is like his mother, like night, the inhibitor of constructive and creative activity. He is like an eternal night without any sun, destructive of life and consequently of Eros. Freud also connects Thanatos to Ares, the god of war, and highlights the active destructiveness of violent action on the world stage. Culture, argues Freud, is the battlefield upon which Eros, Thanatos, Ares, and Ananke do battle for the possession of the world. Ricoeur argues that the symbols of myths require something more than the theories of Freud if their existential implication is to be revealed and understood. Ricoeur locates consciousness in the practical sphere of our activities and begins a quarrel with Kant over what is required in this task of becoming conscious, which is set for man as part of the answer to the question, what is a man? Ricoeur is thinking about the philosophy of Kant when he says, reflection is not so much a justification of science and duty as a reappropriation of our effort to exist. Epistemology is only part of that broader task. We have to recover the act of existing, the positing of self in all the density of its works. Freud and Philosophy, page 45. For Plato, the work of living in a city-state and the duty and responsibility of doing the right thing at the right time in the right way is the fundamental work that a citizen must engage in, on pain of suffering and discontentment with the very condition of his existence. This work is fundamental because the city-state is the arena for all the forms that are reproduced through man's work and desire, namely, children, artefacts, truth, the good, and justice. Both terms, work and desire, are important components of Ricoeur's definition of reflection, which is the appropriation of our effort to exist and desire to be through the works which best witness to this effort and desire. Freud and Philosophy, page 46. There is, in Ricoeur's accusation of Kant, a suspicion that Kant is responding epistemologically to both the empiricists and Descartes when he offers his reflections on the question, what is man? Ricoeur appears here to be basing his claim upon the three critiques, and not on the works on politics, history, anthropology, and religion that Kant has also written. Ricoeur's claims certainly seem to be appropriate to the Cartesian project where the argument is solely epistemological and theoretical. I know that I think, and he comments upon this project in the following way. But this first reference of reflection to the positing of the self, as existing and thinking, does not sufficiently characterize reflection. In particular, we do not understand why reflection requires a work of deciphering, and exegesis and a science of exegesis or hermeneutics, and still less why this deciphering must be either a psychoanalysis or a phenomenology of the sacred. This point cannot be understood as long as reflection is seen as a return to the so-called evidence of immediate consciousness. We have to introduce the second trait of reflection, which may be stated thus. Reflection is not intuition, or, in positive terms, reflection is the effort to recapture the ego of the ego cogito in the mirror of its objects, its works, its acts. But why must the positing of the ego be recaptured through its acts? Precisely because it is given neither in a psychological evidence, nor in an intellectual intuition, nor in a mystical vision. The first truth, I am, I think, remains as abstract and as empty as it is invincible. It has to be mediated by ideas, actions, works, institutions, and monuments that objectify it. Freud and Philosophy, page 43. Kant stands on the other side of the divide between the will and the objects of the will. His claim is metaphysical, and man in his philosophy is revealed by reflection not just upon the epistemological question, what can I know? But on all four questions, which embrace not just metaphysics but ethics and political philosophy as well. Being, as Aristotle maintained, is revealed in language in many ways. Interestingly, in the above quote from Ricoeur, we also find an implicit criticism of the kind of psychology that hitches its wagon to the donkey of evidence. For Kant, the journey of the soul was a matter of the journey on the road to Damascus, Via Dolorosa. The principles involved included the principle of non-contradiction and sufficient reason, and the progress along this road depended upon the goods related to the body, goods related to the external world, and lastly, and most significantly, goods relating to the soul. We need to bear in mind also Spinoza's claim that the first idea of the mind is the idea of the body, as well as the Freudian claim that the primary function of the ego is to protect the body. The relation of the body to one aspect of the external world, i.e. sexual partners, argues forcefully for the Freudian focus upon sexuality in the stages of the development of the personality. Freud's stages on life's way include abandoning earlier archaic practices in favor of new institutional practices that have more realistic aims and objectives. This process of abandonment is a painful affair and is attended with the risk of interference from various defense mechanisms, such as repression, denial, displacement, projection, splitting, etc., which tend to weaken the ego and its attempt to view the world stoically through the lens of Ananke. Such a developmental account must, of course, presuppose a commitment to hylomorphism and its actualization processes. These processes determine the way in which the human form of life interacts with the world in terms of its possibilities, transforming not just the objects of the instincts, but also the aims of the instincts, widening the horizon for the battle of the giants, Eros and Thanatos. Consciousness, we know thanks to the work of Freud, is a vicissitude of the instincts, and we know that for both Aristotle and Freud, the dream was a kind of thinking, in which the body is derealized by the play of images on the dream screen. This may mean that the first idea of the body for the soul may well be an image/hallucination that has its source in the external world. Such images are, of course, not, in a certain sense, real, and this may be tied up with the fact that during sleep, both the motor and the sensory systems of the body are immobilized, and the body seeks a displaced form of instant substitute gratification in the dream. Freud does, however, call such an image hallucinatory, and, as such, it is both a primary process activity and an illusory regressive activity. Dream activity may well be the zero level of thought activity, an almost pure psychic phenomenon blossoming or occurring in a psychic locality. The location must be an important consideration when it comes to determining whether it makes any sense to speak of events and their physical, material/efficient causality. Freud took a clear and distinct stand on this issue by designating the dream as a wish fulfillment, and this must be true in at least one sense, that of ensuring the individual concerned continues to sleep instead of waking prematurely. This wish to continue sleeping is certainly not at the level of consciousness, but for Aristotle it is a type of thinking that carries on during dream activity. For Kant and his trinity of mental faculties, sensibility, understanding and reason, the dream is an activity of sensibility, which Kant regards as an unconscious form of poetry, involving the imagination in a condition in which the body image is inactive, and as a consequence, the dream is not structured in terms of the continuous space-time of waking experience. The imagination may, however, be activated by unconscious concepts, whose source is in the understanding, so the scenes we experience are, to some extent, organized, and not the mere wild play of random images. To the extent that the images we experience may never have occurred in previous experience as they are presented, is the extent to which we are in the realm of illusion and fantasy. The people we dream of, for example, could not possibly have memories of their role in our dreams. If one is hungry in one's dream, one does not know it to be true that one is hungry, and to that extent, our dreams lack veracity. It may be the case, however, that one was hungry when one went to bed, and this is obviously the source of the dream of eating roast beef. Reason has no obvious role in this function of sensibility, in which the concept regresses back to its image origin, instead of occupying the subject or predicate position in an assertion. This may be because reason appears to operate at the level of thinking something about something, which is a more complex level than that of merely thinking something, the domain of conceptual thinking occupying the subject position of an assertion. The sensible functions involved in dreaming are regulated by the primary process of thought and the pleasure-pain principle. Reason is, then, a secondary process operation. The concept of the will is a concept of philosophical psychology, which we do not find discussed in any detail in the writings of Freud. Kantian philosophy, reasoning about the good will during the period of Enlightenment, was experiencing a brief respite in the surge of modernism introduced by Descartes and Hobbes, a period in which modern politics and economics had not yet managed to permeate the consciousness of the general public. By the time we get to the period of Freud's Austria, political parties and nation-states were being dissolved and destabilized, according to Arendt in Origins of Totalitarianism, and the masses were being mobilized by populist rhetoric into thinking, alternatively, that everything was possible, or nothing was possible. The so-called new men that emerged in Europe, the US, and the Soviet Union were, consciously or unconsciously, marshalling various globalization forces for various purposes. It is difficult to know exactly what Freud thought about these political, economic, and military projects, but we do know that he experienced firsthand the rise of Hitler, and in his work, Civilization and Its Discontents, 1929, he wrote disparagingly about both the USA and the Soviet Union. Freud further posed the question as to whether all the energy we expend upon building up our civilizations was worth the effort. Given the year of this work, this judgment perhaps can be justified, especially when we consider the Freudian use and interpretation of the Platonic concepts of the life and death instincts, Eros and Thanatos, battling for the fate of civilization. Plato's Republic can be claimed to be a theoretical construction, partly responding to oracular prophecies relating to knowledge of oneself, and partly relating to the role this lack of knowledge plays in the fate of our civilizations. The Republic also was partly a response to the perceived injustices inflicted upon the governed by governments that failed to understand the importance of the concepts of justice, Dike, and virtue, Arete. Socrates is the leader of the philosophical dialogue, which is essentially searching for the elusive combination of the good in itself and the good in its consequences, and the focus is primarily political, forewarning us of the dangers of tyrants whose lust after power resembles a mental illness. There is very little trace of this kind of reflection in Freud's writings. There is, however, one article entitled Group Psychology and the Analysis of the Ego, which begins with an admission that individual and social psychology are inseparable elements. This has an Aristotelian ring to it, which is highlighted in the hylomorphic essence specifying definition of the human form of life, namely, rational animal capable of discourse. The implication of this definition is that man is essentially a social animal, and given the Aristotelian claim that every human art, scientific inquiry, action and pursuit, aims at the good, The form of the good thus becomes the major social issue in which the question of whether man is the best or worst of animals is resolved. Freud, we know, grounded his psychoanalytic psychology on the foundation of instincts. Yet in the introduction to the above work, Freud specifically denies that there is a primitive social or herd instinct, and claims that membership or participation in different kinds of groups give rise to different mental phenomena. The group par excellence for Freud, however, is that of the family, and this too echoes the Aristotelian position. For Aristotle, the criterion for moving beyond the social group of the family into the village workspace is that of self-sufficiency. The next most important social grouping, next to the family, is that of the village, which also has its limitations insofar as fulfilling our potential for being the best of animals is concerned, a potential which, for Aristotle, involves striving to fulfill the aim of becoming the rational animal. It is, however, the polis, which is of sufficient size and structure to meet the demands of its inhabitants for overall self-sufficiency. The complete essence-specifying definition of the human form of life is rational animal capable of discourse, and it is discourse, rather than rationality, that Freud focuses his attention upon. Discourse manifests itself in one-on-one therapy in the form of the talking cure, but it also manifests itself in social groups. Freud, in a chapter entitled Le Bon's Description of the Group Mind, begins as follows. If a psychology, concerned with exploring the predispositions, the instinctual impulses, the motives and the aims of an individual man, down to his actions and his relations with those who are nearest to him, had completely achieved its task, and had cleared up the whole of these matters with their interconnections, it would then suddenly find itself confronted by a new task which would lie before it unachieved. It would be obliged to explain the surprising fact that under a certain condition this individual, whom it had come to understand, thought, felt and acted in quite a different way from what would have been expected. And this condition is his insertion into a collection of people which has acquired the characteristic of a psychological group. What, then, is a group? How does it acquire the capacity for exercising such a decisive influence over the mental life of the individual? And what is the nature of the mental change which it forces upon the individual? It is the task of theoretical group psychology to answer these three questions. The Penguin Freud Library, Volume 12, London, Penguin, 1991, page 98.